So you'll see that since I sent you the title, I've changed it. There's now a question mark. So in the first lecture, I presented a way of thinking about a kind of agency that I take us to share with other animals. So my aim was to make sense of a whole part causal capacity that is engaged in a way that is genuinely open at the time at which the agent acts, but that doesn't require breaking laws governing the agent's parts and microparts or doing something that has no causal antecedents. In this lecture, I want to think about what we need to add to this picture to get an account of agency that we need to make sense of holding agents responsible for their actions. And I'll very briefly at the end gesture towards the third part of the picture. So, like with yesterday's topic, I'm touching on enormous areas of philosophy and lots of philosophers whose views are related to what I'm presenting, many of whom I'm drawing on, but I can't sketch the picture and also say everything that would be needed to situate my views in relation to everybody else's. So I'm just going to go for it. So a lot of the free will debate is concerned with understanding the kinds of capacities we need to be appropriately liable for being held responsible for our actions. So on the account I presented in the previous lecture, agency is a causal capacity that we share with other animals, so it's part of the natural world. It doesn't require contracausal powers or panicky metaphysics or supernatural abilities, but it's a genuine, irreducible source of causal explanation of what happens. But showing that it's plausible to think that we're agents in that sense is not the same as showing that we have the kind of free will needed for responsibility. We don't hold other animals liable for praise and blame. We don't hold them responsible for their actions in that way. So if we want to work out what we need to add to the causality of agency to get creatures that could be held appropriately responsible for their actions, we need some idea of what we mean by this sense of responsibility that we think humans are liable for and other animals aren't. And I think that's tricky because I think we might not, and I think we don't actually, have a notion of this responsibility that we can clearly specify independently of what we mean by free will, or free agency. I think they sort of bound up with each other. And questions about whether and when people actually deserve praise and blame, I think, are substantive moral questions. But we need some sense of what we're looking for, a sense of responsibility in which it's not appropriate to hold other animals responsible, but could be appropriate to hold us responsible for what we do. So if we take seriously the idea that other animals are agents, there's a perfectly straightforward sense in which their actions are attributable to them. We can say which one did it. We can also take their actions to reflect on them, both at a species level and as individuals. One can say of other animals that this particular individual is relatively aggressive, or impatient, or careless, or nervous, or curious, or a diligent parent. Individual animals differ in these ways, as their actions show. There are presumably a variety of explanations of these differences, including physiological and developmental ones, so poor parenting and impoverished developmental circumstances affect the agency of other animals as well as agents. So we can see other animals' actions as reflecting their having relatively different characters, perhaps what Kant would call empirical characters. And we can evaluate these characters. We can approve or disapprove of them, like or dislike them. We can evaluate them in relation to their contribution to our understanding of the animal's flourishing or its community's flourishing. And we can inform our interaction with other animals on the basis of these characters. We can say things like, this particular elephant bull is very aggressive when in must, be careful to keep your distance. And we can treat animals in ways that we think will cultivate particular kinds of characters, and they do this to each other. So philosophers who are skeptical of free will and responsibility, like Dirk Perboom and Richard Double, point out that even if we don't have the freedom needed for responsibility, we can evaluate humans' actions in these ways, humans' actions and characters. We can see actions as flowing from aspects of people's characters for which they're not responsible, and also as showing a person to be gentle or attentive or impatient or curious, defensive, careless. And we can like or dislike these characteristics, and we can evaluate them in relation to their contribution to an agent's flourishing or their community's flourishing, and we can do things that we think might encourage the development of the ones we like. So Per Boom thinks that this would be a nicer and gentler way of thinking about humans than responsibility judgments. And some standard compatibilists might think that's all we need for responsibility attributions and accountability practices. But I agree with Per Boom and Double that it gives up a lot of what we normally take to be involved in seeing people as responsible. If this was all it was, then saying that our actions can be attributed to us and reflect on us wouldn't be fundamentally different to the way other animals' actions are attributable to them and reflect on them. So I think it doesn't get us the notion of responsibility that's at issue in the ordinary reactive attitudes like gratitude and blame. I think those responses involve more than the thought that an agent's actions reflect more or less pleasing dispositions, ones we like or don't like, or ones that are more or less conducive to the community's flourishing. I don't think we have a totally clear way of saying what more in a non-circular way, but I take it to include something like the thought, the possible application of the thought, that there were considerations the agent could have and should have considered in relation to their choice and action. And these are considerations that the agent could have and should have acted on. Other animals' actions are governed by drives and instincts, and they don't and can't deliberate on whether the inclinations given to them by their natures are choice-worthy, whether their means to pursuing what they're trying to do are choice-worthy, and to choose in the light of such deliberation. So there's a sense of responsibility that just doesn't get a grip in relation to other animals. You can't properly have the thought in relation to another animal, why didn't you think about how that would make him feel? But we do have this kind of thought in relation to human agency. Our kind of agency is accountable. You can ask the agent to account for themselves. And such accounting can involve the person explaining how and why they saw what they were doing in relation to considerations that you think they should have recognized. Now, there are lots of substantive and interesting questions about responsibility, which I'm not going to address at all. I'm just going to be thinking about the basic capacities that agents would need to make sense of such thoughts as that they were considerations that the agent could have and should have recognized and could have and should have responded to. So, of course, the capacity that's usually taken to make the difference between us and other animals is reason. The idea of practical, rational capacities. And the idea that free and responsible agency involves the capacity to respond to reasons is very common in contemporary accounts of free and responsible agency. And it's part of our folk conception of responsible agency. So we hold children increasingly responsible for their actions as their rational capacities develop. And we regard diminished rational capacities as a defense in a court of law. Okay, but we want to understand how practical rational capacities do this work and how they relate to the metaphysics of embodied agency. This is complicated by the fact that there's a large empirical psychological literature that seems to threaten or question the idea that we in fact have or act on rational capacities. It questions the extent to which we really use reason in making decisions about acting, as well as the extent to which the reasons we are prone to give as explaining our actions are in fact rationalizations or confabulations rather than actually explaining our actions. And to make the problem more difficult, I think, the thought that, unlike other animals, we can and should reflect on our ends and means in relation to whether or not they're choice-worthy and choose in the light of this reflection seems to require some account of at least objective-ish normative requirements, because how else is there a sense of choice-worthy? And this is one of Richard Double's objections to the possibility of free will. He says it would require some kind of objective morality. I think that's roughly right, but I'm not taking it as an objection to the possibility of free will. In fact, I think even more strongly, the idea that we had a reasonable entitlement that a person takes some consideration into account suggests that what makes actions choice-worthy needs to be accessible to the agent who we hold accountable. And I think that's also part of our folk conception. So the capacities taken to be relevant in a court of law are the capacity to tell right from wrong. Now, in the contemporary free will debate, the idea that responsibility requires practical rational capacities is often thought to be a compatibilist account of free will. Yesterday, I was complaining that standard compatibilists help themselves to the claim that there's agency in a metaphysically determined universe. That's normally just declared as a starting point, and then our intuitions are interrogated as to whether or not we regard this agency as responsible. But I don't think they're entitled to the claim that there's agency. And it's also sometimes just stated that there's reasons responsiveness or practical rational capacities in a metaphysically determined universe. Dirk Perboom, for example, says this isn't a point that's in contention. But I think it is. So standard compatibilists say that what we need is that there's a possible way that the agent could have been that would have involved their recognizing and responding to the relevant considerations. Okay, so note the assumption that acting is just built in. So John Martin Fisher says that an agent has the capacity to respond to reasons if there's a possible world in which their actual capacities would lead them to do otherwise if there were a reason to. These possible world claims are tricky. Both compatibilists and those who believe in robust alternative possibilities appeal to counterfactuals. One question you might have is whether the idea that a person was able to do something, had the ability to do something, is best captured by the thought that had they been slightly different in relevant respects, they would have done it. So the truth conditions of if you had thrown the ball to me, I could have caught it, are quite different from if you had thrown the ball to me, I would have caught it. Eric Marcus says the ability to do handstands isn't the tendency to do handstands when presented with some particular stimulus. Another difficulty is knowing which are the close possible worlds, because it's obviously not an observational notion. And a further complication is that we could agree on a description of what's true in various possible worlds while disagreeing on what grounds or explains such truths. More strongly, we might think that our understanding of what counts as a close possible world is based on the agential abilities that we think people have to respond differently to things that might happen. So I think this means that rather than appealing to what would follow from a capacity in some possible world, we should try to say more about what the capacities actually involve. What is it actually for an action to flow from your rational capacities? So compatibilists who talk about practical rational capacities, and also you might think Kant says this, and certainly some Kant interpreters say this, talk about action being caused by reason or by reasons, or determined by the good. Susan Wolf says actions being determined by the good. So Wolf says that what matters for responsibility is not the ability to do otherwise, but just the ability to act in accordance with reason. Okay, so note again the assumption of to act. Just have to keep complaining about that. Okay, so there are at least two questions about these capacities. If we take acting freely to be a matter of acting rationally, and acting rationally to be something like having your action brought about by or caused by what you recognize reason recommends, then it seems that there's no way of freely acting imprudently or immorally, which is a classic complaint people have about Kant. And there's also, of course, the problem of saying what it might mean for your action to be caused by reason or reasons. So that's what I want to look at. And I want to suggest that a plausible account of the role practical reason plays in agency doesn't fit with the idea of action being caused by reason or reasons, or by mental states of recognizing reasons. Okay, so the account I sketched in the previous lecture was one that aims to take seriously the idea that the conscious subjective point of view from which an animal agent acts is thoroughly embodied, and also, as the higher level causal capacity it is, a genuine source of bringing things about in the world through the agent's actions. The agent perceives a world, senses itself, has the capacity to move and control itself from its conscious subjective point of view. And I suggested that this can be understood as a kind of higher level control a natural system has of itself. Every time an agent moves, there are things happening in its body that make possible, enable, and explain how it can move itself. But some of what's happening to the agent's body is a function of what the agent as a whole is doing. So this account gives a central role to the animal's mental life in its agency, its purposes and perceptions as understood from its point of view. But it doesn't need to do this by looking for the right kinds of mental event causes of bodily movements in the right ways. So agency doesn't need to be understood in terms of event causal triggers from which a cascade of bodily motion unfolds. Rather, from its conscious point of view, the agent controls its body throughout the process of acting. And it has to do this at every moment that it acts, every moment that it's awake, even when it's not doing much. That's its existential condition. So I think this picture opens up the possibility for a shift in the way we think about the mental states that play a role in explaining the actions of rational agents. So first, because I think it allows us to think that we're agents who can act or not act, rather than being merely a convenient way of looking at the metaphysically determined unfolding of the world. But in addition, I think it changes the role of the mental states we invoke in explaining actions, and the way these make sense of free and responsible agency. So I'm going to focus in particular on intentions. So I think this account enables us to see a way in which what I will call articulable intentions structure rational agency, but without being event causes of actions, but also without being disconnected from the causal capacity that is agency, so located in a separate realm of normative implications. Now, of course, there's a perfectly reasonable sense of words like intention and reason in relation to other animals' actions, but I'm going to use these words for the rest of the talk to refer to the articulable intentions for which rational agents, self-aware rational agents can act. And in the rest of this talk, when I talk about action, I'll be talking about the action of rational agents. So there's an enormous literature on intention, and I can't relate to all of it. So I'm just going to outline what I think an account needs to play the role that we needed to play in accountable agency. Okay, so we're looking for representations that are part of practical reason. And it can be quite puzzling to understand these. And I think one thing that makes them puzzling is that we're constantly tempted to explain them in terms of theoretical reason. So David Velleman, for example, explains practical rational states in terms of theoretical rational states. Anscombe says, modern philosophy has blankly misunderstood practical reason. Another thing that I think makes them hard to understand is that you want to say, well, what is an intention? And then you feel this need to say, well, it's this, and you try to explain it in terms of something else. But it might be that we can't explain it in terms of something else. It might be it's just itself. And a further thing that makes it hard to understand intentions is that they're essentially part of acting, but yet acting on intentions can fail in a variety of ways. So they're essentially part of what it is to be acting, but they don't implement themselves. And this is crucial to the way intentions structure agency, but without being event causes. Okay, so as I'm seeing it, in having an intention, the agent represents what they're doing, how and why, in the particular practical way that is part of acting. We could also call it the maxim the agent wills. So an intention is not just a desire. As Michael Bradman says, in having an intention, you're already embarked on action. An intention is not just a judgment or belief. As Richard Holton argues, in many cases it's unclear what the best thing to do is, or even implausible that there is a best thing to do. So he argues that cognitively limited creatures in a changing environment that's full of uncertainties and temptations, in which deliberation has costs, need an executive capacity that's distinct from a faculty of judgment. At some point, you have to stop deliberating and choose. Having done this, you're in a state that does not look exactly like a belief or desire, and your beliefs and desires might be unchanged. You have an intention. We could say that your intention is your understanding of what you are doing that governs and structures your acting. I think that's not wrong, but it's in danger of making it sound theoretical. So the central point isn't how you're understanding yourself, but what you're intending. As a minded, embodied thing, you have mental states through which you bring about what you represent. This is what it is to be acting. We could also say willing. Willing isn't just wishing or wanting. Willing something involves having a conception of what it is you're bringing about or acting for, as well as how you're doing it, and orienting yourself to it in the way that is bringing it about. So Holton introduces the idea of forming an intention using an example of making a choice. Once you've made a choice, you've got this new mental state, which is an intention. But we can also think of actions as governed by intentions in cases where there doesn't seem to be much choosing, as well as, I think, in cases of relatively habitual or automatic action, an action that's structured by social expectation that you're not deliberating about. You just accept without choosing. So in lots of cases of relatively habitual and automatic action, if somebody stopped you at some point and asked you, what are you doing and why, you could tell them. And if something happened that required you to disrupt the habitual motions, you could. So the action could be under the control of your rational executive capacity, even when you're not consciously thinking about reasons or choosing, and even when a significant part of its execution is automatic. Holton says that intentions move agents to act directly. So I think that what's right about that is that having an intention is not something separate from acting. You're already embarked, as Bretman says. But I think we should resist thinking of intentions as causes of actions. Understanding the way intentions structure actions, as well as seeing problems with thinking of intentions as efficient causes of actions, can be brought out by thinking about the complexity of implementing intentions over time, as well as difficulties we face in sticking to our intentions. So lots of the things you're currently engaged in doing, maybe getting a degree or buying a house or saving for retirement, things you might be doing right now, but they might not involve any movement right now. To do these things, you have to understand and execute a whole lot of smaller actions that are part of the bigger action. And you have to keep yourself oriented to the bigger action at appropriate times, while also doing lots of other things, like feeding yourself and meeting your friends and making your bed. And many of these actions and sub-actions can be implemented in a variety of ways, and you have to be aware of changing possibilities in your environment, as well as ongoing changes in your own state that might change your priorities. So a plan, or higher level intention, that you're also intending, structures and organizes your execution of the series of smaller actions that constitute what you're doing. So thinking about planning is helpful to understand the idea that intentions structure action. But we don't have to think about intentions as always as future-oriented as, a long-term plan. And we don't have to think of action, and we don't have to think of intentions as always as explicit as a plan. We just have to think of action as being executed under the agent's practical orientation to their representation of what they're doing. In addition to the complexity involved in implementing many intentions, we don't always stick to our intentions. And sometimes we shouldn't. So on the one hand, forming an intention is precisely having stopped deliberating. So you can't have an intention and have it constantly subject to revision. But on the other hand, having an intention doesn't set you irrevocably and unrevisably on the path of acting. Part of the difficulty of our task in acting is that succeeding in getting anything done requires resoluteness in sticking to your intentions, but also requires appropriate flexibility. And this is difficult. So Holton argues that this means that sometimes you need another state, which he calls a resolution, which is a higher order principle that structures the way you carry out your intention by introducing an extra intention to not revise your intention. This kind of higher order state is also appealed to by the psychologist George Ainsley in relation to the problem of changing preferences over time. So Ainsley argues that there is no unitary conception of maximizing desire satisfaction that we can understand action as oriented to, because people don't have unitary preferences, but rather a variety of contradictory preferences that become dominant at different times and don't reach a stable resolution. So he says, if a person is ever to see his current long-term plans realized, he must, in his current frame of mind, take into account the tendency of unpreferred goals to become preferred at a later time. And he says we have a few strategies for managing this. We've got patterns of attention and emotional preparation. We've got ways of structuring the world around you, like tying yourself to metaphorical masts. But a central strategy that Ainsley thinks we use for solving this problem is introducing personal rules. So these are like Holton's resolutions. They can be understood as higher-level intentions or higher-level personal maxims. Through such higher-level intentions, agents can structure their carrying out their intentions in the face of obstacles they anticipate, including ones from their own desires. Okay, so this, I think, helpfully brings out the idea that intending is not less than being embarked on action, but intentions and resolutions don't implement themselves. So acting isn't a matter of forming an intention and then the relevant bodily motions just unfolding, never mind choosing or deciding or judging what the best thing to do is and then the relevant bodily motions just unfolding. Our task in acting is much harder and more complex than that. You have to execute your intentions, not just form them, and you have to execute them. So that might make it seem mysterious. What is the self that executes the intentions? But we shouldn't make it seem unnecessarily mysterious. Just as our thoughts belong to us from the unified point of view that constitutes a thinker, it's from the potentially self-aware unified point of view that the rational agent has intentions. In Kant's critique of the Cartesian account of the soul, he argues that the unity of our consciousness tempts us to understand our minds as a kind of unified simple substance that's something essentially different from physical things. This is a mistake, but in rejecting this temptation, we shouldn't go too far in the other direction and fail to notice the role of the unity of consciousness in constituting a potentially self-aware thinking subject. So the thinking subject does not need to be understood as more than the unified conscious point of view a natural system has on itself and the world, from which we think and act, but it also shouldn't be understood as less than that. Kant thinks that because the awareness of our consciousness is a simple representation, in the sense that the representation of the self doesn't have any content beyond unifying our representations as belonging to us, our thinking, acting self. So it doesn't have any content, so it's a simple representation. The simplicity of this representation is what tempts us to think that it's a presentation of a simple thing. But the simplicity of this representation, the fact that it has no content, also tempts us to neglect it and to look to identify the self that acts with the content of some of its representations. So we want to try to identify the self with its beliefs or desires, or higher order beliefs and desires, or special acts of identification, or desires no one can reject. But rather than looking for some further representation and hoping that with the addition of that one, the relevant mental states can be understood as causing bodily motions in the right way, for the bodily motions to belong to the self that acts, we should start with the unified viewpoint that constitutes the thinking and intending self that acts. Just as other animals that have to control the moving of their bodies throughout the process of acting, we have to implement our execution of our intentions throughout the process of acting. And this doesn't introduce an extra non-physical agent or event cause like a weird volition through which the agent starts their bodily motion. Rather, it's the unified point of view from which we have intentions. It's from the unified point of view from which we have intentions that we control the movement of our bodies. In addition to thinking that rational intending is structured by higher order intentions, lots of philosophers think that articulable intending or willing is structured by rational constraints. So there might be some theoretical constraints here, presumably there are, but I'm interested in practical rational constraints. So Honora O'Neill says, it's a requirement of rationality, not merely to intend all indispensable or necessary means to that which is fundamentally intended, also to intend some sufficient means to that which is fundamentally intended, to intend to make means available when they are not, to intend all necessary and some sufficient components of whatever is fundamentally intended, that the different things you intend be consistent, that the foreseeable results of the specific things adopted in acting on a given underlying intention be consistent with the underlying intention. She says, you don't choose to take these constraints as applying to your articulable intending or willing, and you don't merely judge that they apply. Rather, part of what it is to have practical reason is to be practically oriented to these rational principles, to intend or will them. They're non-optional principles of articulable willing, or rational willing. Now, that could be taken to mean that we always act in accordance with what we recognize these principles say we should do. But I think this no more follows than the idea that intentions and resolutions implement themselves. On the contrary, it's only because we will these principles that when we act against them, our action is irrational. It's only agents with practical rational capacities that can act irrationally. What goes on in such failures is puzzling if you think that rational intending irrevocably brings about what you intend. So some philosophers who deny the possibility of weakness of will say we should understand what appears to be an action against your better judgment as instead a revision of your view of what's in your interest. So that eliminates weakness of will by stipulation. It also sees action as declared by a judgment, which I think is a problem. But it's just, I think, completely implausible to life. Anybody, I think, who is an agent or who knows any, knows that we sometimes act imprudently, self-destructively, and immorally. I think only a philosopher could think otherwise. And Holton says that, in fact, the empirical evidence is that it's the reverse reevaluation that happens. When you find yourself choosing to give in to temptation or thinking about it or wanting to, this leads you to reevaluate your judgments about the relative values of the things you're choosing between. Similarly, Ainsley discusses the extent to which we're prone to finding exceptions and loopholes in the rules and resolutions we use to structure our intending. Just one last time, on this special occasion. Why might we do this? Why do we want to find these loopholes? So I agree with David Velleman, who thinks that we have a deep need to make sense of ourselves and that this plays a role in agency. But he thinks of this as causing action. I don't think we need to understand our need to make sense of ourselves as a desire that combines with other mental states to cause action. Rather, it's because we are committed to making sense in the things that we will, we have practical reason, that when we want to do something that's in tension with something we will, whether that's a higher order intention or irrational constraint, we want to find a way to reinterpret what we're doing. But in many cases, this reinterpretation or revaluation or loophole is a rationalization. So the desire to make sense isn't what's causing action, rather it's following a decision and leading to self-deception, rather than real self-understanding. Okay, so far, the account of rational agency I've presented includes acting for articulable intentions that are structured by rational principles that the agent intends or wills. The rational constraints I've considered so far are instrumental. Instrumental reason in the service of desires given to us by our natures wouldn't get us responsibility in the sense we were looking for. So it doesn't get you an ability to act in the light of an understanding of whether your desires are for something that is choice-worthy. So it wouldn't be a significant difference from other animals, creatures with more or less intelligence pursuing desires given to them by their natures. So can we get an account of non-instrumental constraints on rational intending? Constitutivist accounts of morality and normativity seem promising here because they aim to ground normative requirements in the requirements of reason or agency. So they argue that there are commitments that we can see as rooted in agency. And there are a variety of different accounts so they take different starting points, reason or agency or self-constitution. They're, of course, controversial. One worry you might have about them is whether they make ordinary action based in something too high-blown and demanding. Are we really committed to making sense of ourselves, as Velleman thinks, in acting, or unifying ourselves as agents, or expressing our power and autonomy? Are these even plausibly part of what we take ourselves to be oriented to in acting? Aren't lots of our aims more things like getting the taxes filed and the kitchen cleaned? Honora O'Neill and Christine Korsgaard point out that if we take seriously the idea that reasons are things that we give to others, that's what they're for, we can see that the idea of justification is already built into the idea of reason giving. And we can get an account of constraints on reason from this. So I'm going to argue for something like that, but since you might think that Kant scholars are likely to appeal to a very intellectualized account, I want to suggest that we can get to that point from a relatively minimal and naturalistically understood account of reason. So the cognitive scientists, Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, approach the question of what is reason from the perspective of a naturalistic understanding of the question of how reason could evolve that takes seriously experimental evidence showing the flawed and systematically biased way people actually reason. So there are lots of non-conscious inferential systems that we use to extract information from the environment in perception and all sorts of other ways, which don't involve reasoning. So they start off from the idea of reason as a faculty for intuitive inferences about reasons, the purpose of which is primarily interactive, to justify our thoughts and actions to others, and to produce arguments to convince others to think and act as we suggest. Okay, so their starting point is experimental evidence that shows that reason is biased and lazy. We prefer reasons that conform to what is already wanted, or which are easiest to justify. And we're very prone to produce reasons as ad hoc rationalizations. And so there's a psychological literature in which people conclude from this that reason is poorly designed and that we're not primarily creatures that act on reasons. But they argue that rather than concluding that such an expensive and kind of fancy strategy should be dysfunctional, perhaps we've been understanding it in the wrong way. So they argue that these features of reason make sense if reason is primarily or originally an interactive cognitive faculty aimed at justifying yourself and convincing others. So we are animals whose central evolutionary strategy is large-scale social cooperation and interaction, living together with and interacting with large numbers of non-relatives in ways no other mammals do, and sharing and coordinating specialization. So one of our central challenges is cooperation and trust with strangers over short and long-term goals. So understood as oriented to giving and receiving reasons, reason is a capacity that enables us to solve crucial problems by producing justifications and arguments. Giving and receiving reasons enables people to communicate, coordinate, explain, justify themselves, form judgments about the reasonableness and trustworthiness of other agents, and defend our reputations, which are very important to us as social creatures. And they argue that understanding reason in this interactive way fits the experimental evidence about the various ways we reason badly. So the idea that we're prone to rationalizations and confirmation bias makes sense if the origins of the faculty are in justifying ourselves and convincing others. And they argue that these apparent flaws are even actually efficient if you see it in this way. So on this account, reasons are primarily for social consumption, and reason originates in giving and evaluating reasons for actions to others. And you could make that point without this sort of naturalistic starting point. The very notion of reasoning has built into it the idea of justification, but I think it's helpful to see how easily it fits into this naturalistic story. So there is evidence questioning how well we reason and how much we act on reasons, but there's also some basis for pushing back a bit on some of this evidence. some of the skepticism. So some of the psychological literature showing that we always act irrationally has been subject to replication problems. And some of the implications for how bad we are at reasoning may be exaggerated. So we do get ourselves to navigate relatively complex tasks all the time. We may be prone to things like base rate fallacies, but we're also capable of understanding what's wrong with them. And we are capable of understanding it and of taking account of it and correcting it. And the fact that there are circumstances under which we come up with rationalizations and confabulate doesn't show that we don't ever act for reasons. You know, if somebody asks you why you're sitting at the bus stop and you say it's because you're waiting for the bus, it's probably not a confabulation. So, and in fact, Mercier and Sperber point out that the errors we're prone to in decision-making and reasoning on our own, we're much less prone to in evaluating the reasons of others. So the experimental evidence suggests that we reason poorly on our own, but much better with others, and we reason best when reasoning together with people who disagree with us and who push us hardest on our reasons. So the psychological literature questioning reason doesn't have to be taken to show that we don't have the ability to reason and that we don't use it or that we don't act for reasons. But if reason is a faculty of intuitive inferences about reasons, it must have some broadly principled ways of evaluating reasons, in particular reasons for acting. So the interactive faculty that Mercier and Sperber hypothesize is hard to understand as one that's governed only by principles of instrumental reason and logic, especially instrumental reason in the service of individual desires. So giving reasons to others with an aim of justifying yourself and convincing them to do something can't just be a matter of getting them to see that what you're doing is an efficient way of furthering your desires. It involves thinking about their point of view. What would make a reason seem reasonable from their point of view? So if reasons are produced for social consumption, they are for giving to others. And I think it also doesn't seem plausible that this capacity depends on a shared conception of the good, of what we're trying to do or bring about. If the point of the faculty is to enable people who are not necessarily coordinated by nature and who might have disparate goals and desires to coordinate and trust each other. But perhaps it's possible to get some principled ways to constrain reasons just from the very activity of giving and receiving reasons. Here's a rough way of thinking about a very general constraint. What counts as a reason is constrained by the possibility of its being recognizable as a reason by other reason-giving and receiving agents. The suggestion is that in taking yourself to be acting for articulable reasons, you are committed to taking what counts as a reason to be governed by the constraint of it being recognizable as a reason by other reason-giving and receiving creatures. And that involves recognizing reason-giving and receiving creatures as sources of constraints on what counts as a reason for acting. So, there are some constraints on acting for reasons that come from the conditions of the possibility of the interactivist perspective. Not just from agency and not just from reason, but from acting for reasons in relation to other creatures with whom you exchange reasons. This constraint is not something given to you by desire. It's not in the service of some good that you may or may not value. It's not something imposed on you. It's inherent in the activity of acting for reasons or articulable intending. It enables us to evaluate other people's choosing in the light of a principled way of thinking about choice-worthiness. And it's a principled way of thinking about choice-worthiness that we can reasonably be entitled to expect that others respect. So I think it's true that you make yourself who you are through your choices, and I think I agree with Velleman that we want to make sense of ourselves, but we don't, I think, need to say that we act to make sense of ourselves. We act to start a business or get the laundry done, but in acting for reasons, we're committed to constraints on what counts as a reason for acting, constraints that structure how we implement our intentions. Kant sees reason as a faculty of inference that's principled and iterative. So as I mentioned yesterday, the iterative nature of reason is a matter of always asking further why questions. So the idea that the evolutionary origins of reason are social and interactive and based in coordinating social life, trying to convince others and defending your reputation, is compatible with thinking that once you start reasoning in this way, you can apply it in broader and broader ways. So as Peter Godfrey Smith points out, even if the response to a challenge is just, this is how we have always done things, to say this is to offer an explicit defense, and it can be challenged. Have we really? What about that time when? He says, priests, chiefs, and the like might obfuscate, deflect, or ignore such appeals, but once we can reason, the spotlight gets directed on everything. You can even see, I think, how theoretical reason could develop out of this starting point, something which otherwise you might think is a little challenging to explain in terms of our evolutionary origins. If you wanted to develop a metaethics from the starting point, it would clearly require a lot more work. But you can see some contours of how such a thing might go. So metaphysically, the idea of an implicit commitment to seeing reason giving as constrained by the conditions of the possibility of reason giving won't require the existence of anything stranger than animals with rational capacities. It won't start with agents who only have logic and their own desires and try to work outwards to shared reasons from there. Rather, there's no reason giving without a commitment to shared standards of justification, and agents who give and receive reasons are already implicitly committed to some higher level normative constraints governing the shareability of reasons. It's going to involve some kind of universalizing, so recognizing reasons as potentially givable to reason-giving and receiving creatures, which implies seeing reason-giving and receiving creatures as having a significant status, being answerable to. The constraint is based in giving reasons, but that doesn't mean that the only properties of agents that matter are their reason. The things that make their reasons, their needs and vulnerabilities could be the starting point. And the principle isn't telling you to start from an abstract thought or from some impartial interest or good. Rather, the constraints implicit in the giving and receiving of reasons are constraints that are relevant precisely to creatures with interests, needs, and vulnerabilities who are already engaged in acting. So we won't need a way of working back to allowing your own interests to have a legitimate role in what you're thinking about doing. We don't have to say that it's because you're committed to this constraint that it's valid for you. We could just say that it's valid, and it's because you're committed to it that you can reasonably be held to it. There would be room in such an account, I think, for a fair amount of moral life to be a matter of negotiation and to include some contingency. But the account also does not have to be based just on truths about what agents would agree to or construct, but rather constraints that agents should recognize. The idea that reason-giving and receiving creatures have a particular significance and value is in some ways easy to intuitively recognize. So it's not unreasonable to think that people could be expected to recognize this. You could even see why somebody might say that common human reason actually always has it before its eyes and employs it as the standard of its judgment. On the other hand, it often conflicts with what we want to do, and it requires consistency of a sort we lack. So it's also not hard to see how agents who have the ability to recognize other reason-giving and receiving agents as such could fail to do so or fail to respond consistently. There are lots of possibilities for going wrong, and we can see this more clearly if we think about the rationalization and self-deception that I think this account leads us to expect. That's the last thing I'm going to talk about. So you might think that this is a wildly optimistic view of human agency, because it suggests that there's a sense in which agents who have practical rational capacities, who act for reasons, are committed to something in the vicinity of respecting all other agents. And you might think that that's not obviously what you see when you look around the world. And since this kind of view is associated with Kant, you might also think it's implausibly intellectualized. So on the account I've presented of what it is to have an articulable intention, what it is to intend practical rational constraints on this, neither having articulable intentions nor intending rational constraints cause or bring about action. Acting well is hard. It requires self-management and skill. Even at the levels of prudence, implementing your intentions over time requires sometimes not doing what you want to do in the moment. Even at the level of prudence, deciding to abandon your intention and do what you most want in the moment can lead to rationalizations and excuses, although self-loathing is also a thing. It's precisely agents who recognize and can't abandon rational constraints who have an interest in rationalizations and self-deception. They've got an interest in reinterpreting them, what they did, in such a way as to enable them to tell themselves that they made sense. And we come to agency, we develop, starting from a condition of complete vulnerability and without rationality. We have animal desires for sociality and affection. We gradually develop the capacity to recognize reasons and the capacity to master ourselves, and we never stop existing in conditions of vulnerability and dependency to some extent in relation to other agents. In the process of learning to master ourselves and understand what's choice-worthy in relation to others, we constantly learn that some of the desires we simply find ourselves with, we shouldn't act on. And it can be difficult to learn this without understanding yourself as bad. But we've got a need rooted in each agency to understand ourselves as good. So being nurtured in a way that meets your biological needs, including for safety and sociality, at the same time as being led to understand when and how not to act on some desires we find ourselves with, without feeling bad for having the desire, is very tricky, especially when it's done under the guidance of people who have their own problems with doing this. So it's liable to trigger shame and defenses that complicate agents and give them an interest in hiding parts of themselves from themselves. So we don't have to think that having practical rational capacities is likely to make biological agents straightforward and transparent to themselves. On the contrary. And we're highly dependent on social interaction. Our specialty is being social animals with a division of labor. So we need others to think well of us. And we have an interest in accounting to them for our actions in ways that they see as justified. According to the picture I've presented, we're actually at some level committed to the possibility of giving reasons to others who can recognize them as reasons. So both to further our own interests and to make sense of ourselves, we have a strong interest in presenting ourselves to ourselves in such a way that we can give reasons and explain what we're doing. So I think we have prudentially based, developmentally based, and socially based interests in rationalizations. So although we may be committed to making sense, I don't think we act to make ourselves coherent or unified or to make sense. Rather, we want to interpret ourselves in the light of a commitment we have to making sense. So I think embodied rational agents are likely to be prone to look for ways to see themselves as justified. Okay, it's just the final point. I'm going to skip over masses of necessary argument and development to gesture towards a final part of a broadly Kantian account just because I think it further complicates this picture. So I've given an account of practical rational capacities in action that make possible holding you responsible for your actions. The final part of the picture is what is actually required to exercise this capacity for yourself. And Kant thinks that this requires each of us being able to exercise our agency in conditions of reciprocal non-domination with each other. And he argues that this requires more than just virtue, respect, and good intentions. He thinks that it further requires the just rule of law under an authority that represents all of us and that creates and enforces the conditions of our all being equally able to act for ourselves. Now, there's lots to be said about how to understand that and what it involves. The only thing I want to note here is the idea that an authority that represents all of us is something that we all, he thinks, rationally will. And the content of this willing is something that we will as a we. So our rational willing is structured by the idea that we're all committed to everybody's equal external freedom. I haven't argued for that, of course, but I take it to follow from this that when we exist in conditions of injustice, we exist in conditions in which something we're rationally committed to is absent, but we can't fix that by any individual action. And that means, I think, that we can't fully make sense of our lives and our options for acting. In conditions of injustice, even when we're going about our lives doing things which should be morally neutral, they're embedded in conditions of complicity in ways that mean that our options don't fully make sense. And it's possible for us to see this. It follows from something we're basically committed to in being able to think about our actions at all. But we want to make sense to ourselves, and we have an interest in thinking that our lives reflect entitlements we have. So we have an interest not just in self-deception about our motives, but about the rightness of our ways of life. So the point of this very brief sketch is just to indicate that far from leading to hyper-rationalized, fully transparent agents, the complete account explains a pervasive pressure to moralized self-deception, delusional and dehumanizing ideologies that enable us to screen off from our attention injustice in which we're systematically implicated, and to pay attention to our entitlements to the exclusions of others. So I think that action requires the agent moving themselves as a whole. I think we get that at the level of the causality of the body. And it also requires a unified point of view, but there are other ways in which it need not involve unity. There might be reasons to think we can't be made fully coherent, and that apparent coherence might lead us astray. So compatibilist philosophers, or at least some of them, when they're talking about talk about actions being caused by reasons, or caused by reason, or determined by the good, or caused by a mechanism that would have responded differently in different circumstances. But I think there are problems with seeing judgments as efficient causes of action, as well as seeing other mental states in this way. It doesn't take account of the complexity of implementing intentions over time. Seeing articulable intending as structured by rational constraints gives an account of an embodied agent that controls its body from its unified point of view and has to, from this point of view, implement its intentions throughout the process of action. So willing isn't just judging or desiring, or judging plus desiring, but willing isn't an extra psychic muscle or some strange act of non-physical volition that causes bodily emotions. It's a self-conscious systems, natural systems, executive capacity that's structured by reason. You can see why somebody might say the will is practical reason. So you're in the world, you're trying to do things like reduce your carbon footprint and get dinner on the table. The way you're situated in relation to other people might mean you can't fully make sense of your options for acting. Your desires pull in lots of directions. So acting might not entirely unify you, but you've got no option but to act. This involves having intentions and higher level intentions and rational constraints that you will. And you will these constraints even when you don't act in accordance with them. Having this capacity makes it possible for us and unavoidable for us to evaluate our inclinations, our desires, and decide whether and how to act on them. And this makes our actions imputable. Other animals move themselves as a whole. They control their bodies from their conscious point of view, but they act on inclinations they find themselves with in ways that are structured by their instincts and desires. Our executive capacity is structured by rational commitments, including that of respecting other such agents as constraints on reasons. And this means that we can hold each other accountable. But we have a long way to go before we can all equally exercise our agency for ourselves in conditions of reciprocal non-domination. That's it.
I'm not the keeper of intentions, I am the keeper of the queue. And I hope you've brought your winter coat. Same procedure as yesterday, hand fingers. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If you have a follow-up, please raise a finger, and I'll do my best to get through everybody. Who would like to start? Grads, perhaps? No? Okay, why don't we start with you? And then please keep your hand up so I can recognize you.
Okay. Thanks. So I guess I wanted to just ask if you could say more about the relationship between the two talks. So it sounds like so is the metaphysical possibility of freedom that you secured yesterday, I mean, a condition for a practice of the sort that you described today being one that involves the imputation of genuine accountability or some sort of other relation between, because it seems like even even without the findings of yesterday's talk, it would be a very interesting discovery. Like this could very well have application, that we engage in these practices and it has these meta ethical implications. So I'm just really asking if you could say more about what the relation is between the two. And one possibility was that there's a kind of condition provided by the findings of yesterday's talk that allow this to involve the imputation of genuine accountability.
Thank you. It's a great question. So there's an enormous literature on moral responsibility and practices of accountability in which most people assume that it's a sort of just a standard compatibilist position. And one can say a lot of the things I've said in engaging with that literature. So I happen to think that they're just wrong about something underneath their positions. And so that the whole, but I could agree with everything, that people say about the, conversational accountability practices and all of, so you can have whole debates about reactive attitudes and accountability practices without agreeing on whether or not it's compatible with determinism. But I actually think it can't be compatible with metaphysical determinism. So I think that it's contained in the content of reactive attitudes is the thought that you didn't have to do the thing that you did. So gratitude involves the thought that you did more than you had to do. And blame involves the thought that you really could have not done that thing. So I think that basic accountability attributions require that at the time of action, it's up to the agent how to act. But, obviously all the people writing about reasons responsiveness disagree, so we could talk about this stuff without that disagreement. But I do think that there's a further difference, which is that there's this whole literature on this causal theory of action, and action is caused by beliefs and desires, and intentions causing actions, that I think is how you try to make a compatibilist story bring the mental states that are relevant to action into their story. And I think the account I was presenting of the conscious point of view from which an animal controls itself, if you take that possibility seriously, you don't need to start looking for belief, desire, causes of bodily emotions. You have a different picture of the structure of action. And then I think that the intentional states that play a role in human agency can fit into that different picture in a way that to me just makes more sense of the way intentions actually work than thinking that like beliefs and desires cause actions or something.
Tim.
Thank you. You may have already answered my question, but I'll try again. At the end of the last lecture, you gave a picture of agency, and you said this isn't enough for moral responsibility, which totally agree. The question is, what comes next? The last part of the lecture today, when you described our relation to each other as creatures who are capable of exchanging reasons and offering them to each other and so on, that seemed to me just the right addition, right? We can't stand in that relation to non-rational animals, as far as we know. And most of the reactions that go under the heading of blame consists, as it were, in modifications that only make sense within the relationship that you described in the last part of your talk. So that seemed to be totally right. I agree about that, and also I think I agree with your picture of kind of philosophy of action that is not thinking of intentions, desires, other as event causes and so on. I think I can be a compatibilist, I think, and believe that too. So my question really has to do with the word could on the first page of your paper. There's a possible way in which the agent could have been that would have involved their recognizing and acting on the relevant considerations. And that's what you brought out in your response to the first question. And that's where I wasn't completely decided. So I might say, if the way a person acted reflected a failure to take an evident reason that I have into account in deciding what to do, that might trigger a reaction, one or another kind of blame reaction. Or if they did something to help me, and it might trigger a reaction of gratitude, right? So I might start by taking what John Martin Fisher calls the actual sequence, right? So I might say, look, my reaction on the one hand is kind of negative reaction, some form of blame might be made appropriate by the actual way in which they did or didn't see certain considerations involving a relationship as bearing on their action, and similarly with gratitude. In each case, we could say there's another way they might have looked at it. You know, they might have not. I wouldn't have been grateful if they did it only to get their name in the paper or something. That's another way they might have done it. Or in the negative case, they might have actually seen the fact that it would cause me pain as a reason not to do it. Right. But I wonder how relevant that could is, yes, there was this other way. And is it relevant whether that particular individual in some sense actually could have seen that, as opposed to it being an eligible consideration, which in general, a person with general rational capacities ought to be able to see, but maybe they have some kind of deficiency or blind spot. Does that mean that, you know, I ought to go on trusting them because they just can't get it in their head that I'm depending on them and that matters, or something? It seems to me, I'm inclined to think that the actual sequence without, and I also wouldn't go for John's tracing requirement, which seems to me irrelevant. So why not? They're like that, and this action showed that they are like that, and that makes a kind of response to me appropriate. So you want to say that our ordinary reactions build in a stronger could there, and that's what I'm curious about.
So it's a great question. You're putting your finger on, in a way, sort of a point that I'm not very sure, when I think about it, I'm not very sure how to argue it, because it's sort of, I was thinking about it last night after a conversation with Chris about, sometimes I just sort of feel like there's just a blank disagreement between compatibilists and incompatibilists, because it feels to me like I just can't really make sense of there being action in such a case, or of there being rational capacities in a case where there was only one thing that could have happened. But the way in which I would try to motivate it would be by, so I think that in a case, so think about a case in which a person does something wrong, and you think that they actually did see the reason why they shouldn't have done it, but they chose to do it. So they could have chosen not to do it. So they chose to do it for this bad reason, and we think that they could have chosen not to do it. And a thing that I think makes that plausible is thinking about managing oneself in relation to prudence. You know, so
in relation to what?
Just prudential reasons. So procrastinating or something. You know, like. You know, you want to get a good night's sleep, and scrolling your phone late at night is a really marginal pleasure, but there you are, scrolling your phone. And I think that both at the time when you're doing it and also when you look back at it, you think, and I think correctly, I could have not done that. It was just perfectly possible at the time when I was sitting there scrolling my phone for this marginal and not really significant pleasure, that's what I knew that it was. I could have just not done that. And I think that I find it hard to understand what implementing an intention over time involves, if it not being that at every moment that you're doing it, you have something that you're trying to do, and you're doing it or choosing to do it. And I think that the doing it or choosing to do it involves being able to not do it. And so, but I don't really, so this is something I really need to think more about, because I don't really know how to argue with somebody who just doesn't think that.
Well, I agree with your description of the phenomenology of deciding, yes, and with the sense of the openness. Well, what happens is going to depend on how I decide. So I agree about that as a phenomenology, but I'll just, to let other people ask, I'll just follow up with one question which was opened in my mind, but puzzles me. It might help to understand the bruteness of the disagreement. That is the question we're addressing our mind to when we ask about whether that could is essential, is that a moral question, or is it a question in, as it were, the philosophy of action or the psychology of action? So I'll put it, you might think, look, blame isn't appropriate in this case because he couldn't have. There's something about the appropriateness of the moral response, my deciding not to trust him or writing him off as a friend or whatever I might do. It's a condition on those things that there be a stronger could there, right? That's one way of thinking about what are we trying to ask. On the other hand, we might say no, it doesn't come from that side. It's just somehow already inherent in a freestanding thought about what's going on when we're asking. I don't know quite the answer to that question. I tend to come at it from the moral side, and that may be why I'm less sensitive to the way in which you're posing it, and that so in that way I've learned something from your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I want to have both of those, and I think that when you think about yourself having chosen to procrastinate or do something that you think you shouldn't have done, I think the absolutely natural way it feels is that you could have not done it. And I think that philosophers don't want to think that because they think that that would be scientifically not respectable. But that's why I wanted, going back to the first question, that's why I wanted to say that there's a way of taking all the science on board, don't have to break laws, don't have to have any funny causation going on, and just think that this is part of the natural world, that there are creatures with these powers that can do something or not do something, and we can do something or not do something structured under our rational capacities. So we don't need to retell what seems like a natural story to say that, when you were looking at your phone last night and you decided to carry on doing that, you actually could have not done that. And I think it actually, I think there are a variety of ways in which we sort of mislead ourselves about the nature of willing. And one of them is thinking about willing as a muscle. So like telling people to try harder rather than helping them build the skill of executive capacity. But one of them is, I think it wouldn't be helpful to tell people, well, you're just sort of passive with respect to it. Like either you're going to keep scrolling your phone or you're not. And, it's going to happen one way or another. It's like, no, this is the thing you have to do. You have to implement your intentions all the time. That's my picture.
Chris, did you want to ask a question? Okay, great. You're next.
I'm thinking about the conversation we had yesterday also. And I want to start by putting forth a kind of Harry Frankfurt point. So just go back to the animal sort of agency. You imagine a case in which animal wants to do something and the animal does it. And in the Harry Frankfurt scenario, maybe there was something installed in its brain, which if it had decided not to do it, would have stopped it and made it do it anyway. So there's only one thing that could have happened. But in fact, the device didn't come into play and the animal did what it wanted. And isn't that agency, even though there's only one thing that could have happened?
Great. So I have a view about the Frankfurt-style counterexamples. The two main things that I would want to say about them. So the one thing I want to say about them is, that's sort of a small point, and it's actually Helen Stewart's point. But so the way they're typically told is that people say, very powerful counterfactual intervener makes you do this other thing. So I just want to say we should redescribe that to say, not as makes you do something. There isn't, you're not doing anything in that case. Yeah. But so the way I think about these cases is that there are different kinds of ways of losing alternative possibilities. One is having your action a causally determined function of previous states of the universe. And one is a powerful counterfactual intervener stopping you from being able to do certain kinds of things. And I think they're both significant ways of losing possibilities of doing otherwise. They both matter, but in very different ways. So, and I would say that, so if there's a all-powerful counterfactual intervener who will for example, always stop you from succeeding if you want to do the right thing, then your capacity to act for yourself in the world is completely limited. So I think in that case, you lack external freedom, what Kant calls external freedom. So I think in terms of the third part of my picture, when your action is subject to the control or domination of somebody else, and the Frankfurt interveners are extreme cases because they're these super powerful counterfactual interveners who can stop you from ever doing any kind of thing, then your capacity to act for yourself is completely limited. But I think you still have the causality of freedom and practical reason. So it's still the case that you have the capacity to move your body, and it's still the case that you have the capacity to act for rational intentions in a way that's structured by rational constraints. So in the case in which there's no intervention, you exercised your causal capacities with your practical rational capacities, and your action flowed from that. So that I think explains how in the non-intervention case you're responsible for the bad things that you do when the counterfactual intervener would stop you from doing good things. But so you are lacking a certain kind of alternative possibility, but not the kind that determinism would remove, rather the kind that injustice removes.
Okay. You may have already answered this, but I mean, now I want to talk about an intervener that's not an outside force and doesn't hurt your freedom. Is it enough to give you the alternative possibilities you want, that if you had known it was wrong, you would not have done it? Or if you had thought it was wrong, you would not have done it? Or does the two possibilities have to be prior to that?
So does it make a difference to your responsibility if you had known it was wrong, you wouldn't have done it?
Well, I'm just wondering you think there always has to be a possibility of doing one thing or another. And I'm just wondering if that possibility has to exist independently of your thoughts about whether the thing is right or wrong, or if it can just depend on them.
I mean, I don't think you need capacities to do things that are completely disconnected from your psychological state. But I think it's not usually the case that your psychological state is such that there's only one thing that you can do. I don't know if is that answering you or not. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either.
Maybe come back.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
Thanks. My question was the first one, but I'll maybe try to build on that. I guess I want to see a clearer connection between the activity of justifying ourselves to others and reasons, and freedom and account on the one hand, and freedom and accountability on the other. Maybe one way of asking is, to get the kind of accountability we care about, sometimes it's distinguished from mere grading, right? I mean, I do something, maybe I know I could have, or I know this person could have done it better, so, I give him a B or a B plus on it. But that may not be the same thing as holding you accountable. And rationally justifying ourselves to one another may be an activity we go in for, and we might get interested in maybe we might be capable of grading ourselves and one another on how well we do this thing of rationally justifying ourselves to one another. But that might fall short of holding one another accountable and holding ourselves accountable. And I'm sort of wondering if that's a salient difference for you.
So I'm not sure if I'm fully getting what you're getting at. So I might need a bit more help. But so you're thinking of a practice of exchanging reasons that doesn't involve thoughts like, why did you do that? Or you shouldn't have done that? Or
yeah, I could say, so there's a picture of rational agency as responsiveness, at least on the reasons responsiveness picture, I might be pretty good at acting on reasons, or I might not be pretty good on acting on reasons. And if sort of that picture is behind the justification picture, then it seems like I can look at you and say, oh, there were a bunch of reasons there that you didn't act on. You get a B. And you can look at me and say, oh, look, you acted on all the reasons. You get an A. But that doesn't seem like holding one another accountable.
Yeah, I agree that it doesn't. So there's something, I mean, part of what got me trying to develop this picture in this talk was that when I read the reasons responsiveness literature, people talk about the capacity to respond to reasons, and then they give abstract descriptions of it, like, had there been a good reason, you would have responded. But I'm always thinking, but what is this capacity supposed to be? Like, how does it work? What does being determined by the good mean? What is it to be able to consider reasons and respond to them? And I'm just always kind of puzzled by what kinds of capacities are meant to be being invoked in the background of these accounts. So, Fisher talks about reasons responsiveness in terms of a receptivity and a reactivity. So, and both of those sound to me like passive mechanisms. Like there's sort of reasons in your vicinity, and your reason module triggers them, like perception, and then your action module kind of responds and starts. And I'm just like, I just don't know. I just don't get it. So I started just trying to think more about how I would try to make sense of what that would be. And then the more I think about that, if I think about rational intending and that being structured by rational commitments and resolutions and higher order intentions, I can't make sense of it as thinking of it in these passive ways. It seems to be something you have to be doing the whole time through the process of executing it. And then that makes it hard. So then I could see a kind of a grading. So I was mentioning yesterday in relation to animals, Robert Sapolsky, who's got this book on determinism, why there's no freedom, but he's got this sort of charming description of watching some baboons and how the one baboon he thinks is always going to blow it, because this one baboon is just like not very good at doing this one baboon activity and always like stops too soon. And so you could say, well, like B+ baboon, like you know, but that's where I would get the grading in. But I think as soon as we get to the articulable intending structured by rational commitments, I just kind of don't. So this is a bit back to the kind of blank comprehension, and I really do need to work on that.
Okay, thanks.
Sloan's next.
Good. This is in some ways related, because I was trying to just to fit. There's a lot of parts of the picture, and I was trying to figure how they all fit together. So I wondered maybe if you could just talk me through an example. So again, on the animal side. So there's the story of Chrysippus's dog. So it might be apocryphal, but we don't have any surviving like writing by Chrysippus. But supposedly he tells this story about this dog that's chasing a rabbit through the woods on a path. The path branches off in three ways. The dog smells the first path, smells the second path, and immediately goes on the third path. So like it's a nice little story. It looks like it's performing disjunctive syllogism or something like that. But what's nice about the story is you're not like, that's crazy. There would never be an animal that did that. So presumably, let's suppose the dog got it wrong. Like actually the hare went down the second path. So I take it on your account. You don't want to blame the dog. So I guess like what is it? Why? Or maybe there's multiple things. Like why are we not? So it looks like one possibility is in the beginning it was about considerations the agent could have and should have considered in relation to their choices and actions. It looks like there are considerations they could have and should have, like maybe there actually was the smell of the thing on the second and they didn't. Another possibility was that the agent didn't take some of the options to be choice-worthy. I don't know. It doesn't seem crazy to me to say the dog deemed the third path as to be chosen. It didn't like use those words, but another possibility is that it didn't have these higher order intentions that structure its intentions. That seemed to be an important part. That seems to be a weird way of saying what's going wrong in the dog story. But it might not have though. So maybe that's the answer. And then the thing that came up in the later part of the talk was this bit about giving and receiving reasons. So is it multiple of these? Is it like one or the other? Something that I'm not talking about? Do some of these parts have to go with the others? Yeah,
it's a great question. I think I would say, so in a way I'm trying to sort of build up to a total picture, but it is, I think, the total picture that one wants. And the total picture, as Christine's work has done so much to bring out, involves a self-conscious agent who, from its self-conscious point of view, is able to deliberate about reasons that it can articulate to itself and it could articulate to others in ways that enable it to have, it's got metacognition of sorts that is just sort of way beyond what could be reasonably expected of a dog. Okay. And you couldn't think of the dog, why weren't you thinking about the rabbit's feelings? It's just not, it's not a reasonable thing to expect it to be able to think about. It's not, and it's not that animals don't understand that other animals have minds. They do, they hide and they understand their own kind as having minds and other kinds as looking at them and chasing them and doing things. But they can't be expected to think about their interests. But because they don't have the unified metacognitive capacities that involve a commitment to respecting the interests of the other creatures that you're giving and receiving reasons to, which I think you could bring into that story away in which you just not what you were asking about, but just I was giving an account of why we have interests in respecting other reason giving and receiving respecting other reason giving and receiving agents. But I think you could get from there to also recognizing the interests of other animals from in that story. But that's not what you're asking about. But just wanted to mention it.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know your name.
David. Thank you. I'm an artist, so I have a philosophy of art question. It seems a problem I have with, so I adhere to Suzanne Langer's philosophies of art. When you talk about non-natural sort of properties being like adhered to morality, I think people do that with artworks. And yesterday what I heard was something like central nervous systems developed and creatures were able to feel their way around the world, and then it becomes more complex and they can privilege certain feelings. So that what I'd like is that when someone's looking at a painting, the important thing is not some property in the painting, but it's the feeling they're having in relation to experiencing the painting. So it's experience that will be valued. As an artist, I don't want to be responsible for having some beauty particles in my painting. So I'd like, would you be sympathetic to that the experience, the feeling would apply in a situation of art? That does that make sense at all?
Sure.
That,
I think that can completely have a place in the picture.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Samantha.
Thanks so much for the talk. I want to hear more about what the unified practical point of view is and what kind of like simplicity that it has. So here's a Kantian way to ask it, which may or may not be helpful. But the real question is like, could you say a little bit more about what the unity of that practical point of view is? So if we're thinking about the unity of apperception, it's the I think must be able to accompany all my representations. And so I'm wondering if there's a practical analog. So here's some that I thought about. So I intend must be able to accompany all my desires. I reason must be able to accompany all my intentions. Or I think must be able to accompany my intention. So it's really just saying, like, what is the minimal simplicity of the unified practical point of view?
It's a great question. And I'm not totally sure what I want to say, but I think one could possibly do it just with I think. So I take it that Kant's thought is that for everything you're thinking, but then I would say also intending, or anything you're cognizing, so that would include practically cognizing, your awareness of yourself is your awareness of your cognitions belonging to you. And there isn't anything else. So it's just, so there isn't, it's not, so that's what makes it simple. It's just that you're aware of them as belonging to you. So maybe I cognize, because that would include practical cognition. So you are aware of your intentions as belonging to you. And of course, just like with the cognition of the world case, you're not going around the world thinking about that all the time, but it's always possible for you to think about that. So it's always, because your intentions do belong to you, it's always possible for you to be aware of them as belonging to you. So I think I kind of think that the first critique is emphasizing the position of knowledge and theoretical cognition, but it's the same self. And it's an embodied self in the first critique as well. I think an essentially embodied self. So I think the thinking, acting self that has a unified point of view is the same self as the thinking point of view that, uses the categories to be aware of a world that's separate from it and aware of itself. And I think in an interesting way, so, one of the things I've obviously been thinking about and preparing for these lectures is wondering about the extent to which my ideas are disagreeing with Christine's or not. And initially I thought they disagreed more, but I came to think it might, apart from maybe the compatibilism thing, be a difference of emphasis. Because she's sort of starting from self-consciousness and the self, and I was starting from giving reasons and recognizing others. But in a way, just as in the deduction, the point is that you don't get awareness of a world without awareness of yourself. You don't get awareness that there's space without awareness that you have a point of view on the space. And maybe the same thing is true of awareness of the unity of the practical self is the practical self in relation to giving reasons to others, and the two things sort of come together. So I'm thinking in a way it's kind of the same. Transcendental unity of apperception. What more do you need?
So much.
Thanks so much. The picture is really exciting and interesting. I wanted to ask, especially about some of the meta-ethics. So as I want to say back part of the view to make sure I'm getting it right, but that in a way, the picture of practical reason is designed to make sense of practices of accountability, because what it is to be a reason is to be a consideration that takes place in the space of interpersonal justification. I was actually surprised to hear what you just said. I have to think about it more, but that does strike me as a starting point being really different from Chris's. But the part of what I'm wondering about is whether it would be an implication on the view that it's not possible to have rational agents who aren't in the business of interpersonal justification. It seems like it is possible. So I would think that there can be practical agents who act for reasons, who are self-conscious, who are self-critical, who can have goals, and whose goals could be accessible by non-instrumental standards, but who are essentially, or who are non-social. And that just seems like not possible in your view. Or if they did have, if their wills were subject to rational assessment, it wouldn't be for reasons like us. Like what it is for us to have a reason just is to have a consideration that plays in this space of interpersonal justification. And so they'll have, reason stars and we'll have reasons or something like that. But maybe this isn't a worry if what we're trying to do is just understand what kinds of reasons creatures like us are subject to. But does the view have the implication that there just can't be non-social rational agents?
I wouldn't want to say that. I don't want to sort of make like strong possibility rulings, but I'm trying to think about, agents like us as we are and, embodied in the world and as we developed, and what reasons are like for us. It's quite hard to think about what totally non-social embodied rational agents would be like. And so I don't have a problem with a lot of the basis of what provides reasons for us being sort of contingent on our natures and situations. And so like completely, I mean, they wouldn't have a practice of reason giving, I assume, if they're non-social. So I haven't said that the practice of reason giving exhausts reason. I mean, it might be. I find it not implausible that it gives an account of how actually theoretical reason would have developed, that it would have started with this. So philosophers like to imagine that like the basic case is like formal logic, and then it would be weird. Moral reasons are like these weird things that you need to like kind of give arguments for because everybody's going around the savannas with formal logic. And the sort of Mercier and Sperber saying is like, no, the basic thing is sharing reasons. And it's not mysterious, actually. It's just like, this is a thing we do. And like we've learned these ways of representing arguments formally. And that's just but of course there is all the, the formal stuff and there is all theoretical reason. And so it's definitely not meant to say this exhausts reason. It's meant to be an account of, firstly, to show that, in a way, I'm sort of slightly a rhetorical move. I'm trying to appeal to slightly more naturalistic-minded philosophers and say, like, actually, this Kantian story isn't as weird as you think it is. Because look, there's actually really kind of a plausible developmental story about how you would get there. So, but it's about, the kinds of reasons we would have and how this practice would develop. But it's not exhausting what reason is.
Can I ask a short follow? Okay, so I thought that was super helpful, but I thought that what it was to be a practical reason was to be a consideration that figured in the activity of interpersonal justification. And if that's a claim about what it is to be a reason, then it's hard to then imagine what kinds of reasons there could be for creatures who aren't in that activity. So I totally see the thought that if what we're interested in is providing a set of constraints on what counts as a good practical reason, all we would need is to say that our reasoning is essentially structured by the interpersonal justificatory activity that we're essentially involved in as people with or creatures with this capacity. But I thought from that we got an account of what it was to be a reason. Yeah, and that was what I was worried had an entailment that looked too strong.
So if I just say what it is to be a reason for us.
But then I think creatures who aren't in the interpersonal justificatory activity business, reasons for them and reasons for us will just be like two completely. They'll be fundamentally different kinds of category. Like,
well, they might just not have practical reason.
That's what I was thinking you would have to say, but that's kind of surprising to me.
I guess. With sort of odd sort of science fictionist examples, I think one usually would need to seek like quite a bit more detail. So I think I would need to imagine in more detail what they would be like to quite know what I would say.
Maybe I can call on my own finger. I was really curious about the way you thought about the audience for reason giving, because one of the reasons that we don't want to go with the golden rule is because as a basis for morality, it might make a morality too much dependent on what I am like, such that it's okay for others to treat me in the way that that I can treat others in the way that I would like to be treated. And so when I'm thinking about other people that I might encounter, potentially they're quite varied.
Sure.
And what they accept as a reason might be quite radically, variable. And so I guess just to ask you, how much are you thinking about the actual people we encounter as the audience that has to recognize our reasons such that the thing that we deliver as a reason is a reason? And how much of it is it idealized? And perhaps two ways of pushing this a little bit is, I think intuitively I want to distinguish between giving a reason and manipulating. So guilting somebody into something or like appealing to the baser natures or whatever might not be a reason in quite the same way. And I think the other way of asking the question is, suppose I start out with just a whole bunch of people who are very self-interested. Is there a story about, and they just might not get together very much unless they engage in very, very enlightened self-interest. And then this issue about like hyper-intellectualization might come up again.
So to the extent that I'm trying to draw on this sort of naturalist developmental story, I am thinking about non-idealized, starting with people who actually encounter each other and their differences, which might include like, big differences in what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it and what they think is valuable. And I think that's just a problem for humans. That's part of the situation. So human groups encounter each other and they're like, why are you doing that? And then the others are like, well, we were trying to do this, or maybe they just start killing each other, but not necessarily. Sometimes they'll be like, well, we're trying to do this, and do you want to try to do that? And so doesn't have to be starting with like agreement about what you're trying to do. It's articulating a conception of what you're trying to do that gets the other people to see what you're trying to do, or maybe even try to convince them to come on board with what you're trying to do. I'm sort of seeing that as the developmental story. So it's neither assuming an idealized situation, but it's also assuming like human animals as they actually are, which are on average not unselfish, but not only selfish, and who encounter each other and have to negotiate and communicate and explain what they're doing, and it's not always easy, and they often fail to respect each other, and they don't understand each other's intentions, but it's not impossible to communicate with them, and that sort of basic picture.
So is it an implication of your view that suppose I'm able to guilt one person into performing an action, but I'm not able to guilt somebody else into performing that action using the very same words, then to the extent that guilting the person into an action, then that is actually a reason because they're moved by this and they recognize that they should help me or do whatever. So I have a reason insofar as that person accepts my justification. But this other person, I'm only pointing in Quinn's direction, I'm not pointing at Quinn, he is not accepting my justification. And so I don't have a reason relative to that person. Is there a fact about what my overall status is? Do I have a reason or do I not? If some people are liable to accept something as a reason and others not. And might there be a reason to break the tie by looking at, well, the objective reasons that people ought to respond to are, don't let yourself get guilted into stuff.
So I didn't get very far in trying to develop any kind of meta-ethics, and that's not something I've ever done. So I don't have an account of I don't even have really many ideas about exactly how that would go. But my thought is that if there are constraints on what counts as a reason that come out of the conditions of respecting other agents as constraints on reasons, those constraints are objective. And they're things that you can and should recognize. But there could also be space for a fair amount of it to be, it could be very context sensitive, and they could, some of the constraints could be contingent, but I'm thinking about the possibility of a picture that could end up with some objective things that people ought to recognize.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question regarding your conception of practical reason, and at one point of your talk, there was that opacity problem. Because, okay, on the one hand, it seems to be very plausible that we can achieve or have an insight in our maxims or intentions. But for example, in therapeutical or therapy contexts, there is also the possibility, okay, maybe we need social interaction to restore our possibility to get insight in our maxims, or to just correct our maybe social behavior of practical reason. And I would be interested in how would you, or what your thoughts on that example.
So the first case was needing help in understanding our intentions. So I think that's super common. Mm-hmm. Like, when you're running for the bus, you're probably aware of what your intention is. But when you're sabotaging your relationship or passive-aggressively serving your mother-in-law the thing she hates while pretending to put on a lavish spread, there are lots of ways in which we sabotage ourselves or act out motives that we don't fully have insight into. And that's meant to be sort of built into the picture, that's kind of part of the nature of human agency, that the picture leads you to expect that human agents would be like that. And then in those cases, it can be that you need somebody else to help you see what you're doing in these patterns, or help you notice what's going on. I think it's usually the case that it's possible for you to do that. In fact, I think that this is an example from Eric Marcus as well. If somebody claims to be supporting their brother while actually, in fact, constantly undermining them, the fact that the motive is in some way maybe not fully conscious doesn't tend to make us think of it as more excusable. We tend to think, like, you should realize that this is what you're actually doing. So it's because it actually is under your practical rational capacity, and it's possible for you to realize that we do actually still think it's something you could be accountable to. But I think there are just lots of ways that we aren't very transparent to ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, it's 5 o'clock. There are several people I didn't get to. My apologies to them. We do have another reception, once again, right through that wall. And with that, please join me in thanking our speaker.